AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. Brett Johnson with you here on a Tuesday afternoon. Well, usually on Tuesdays, we are joined by Patrick Coulican, who, of course, is the editor-in-chief of the Minnesota Reformer, but he's out of town this week, so instead, we're going to be joined by Max Nesterak. He is the deputy editor of the Minnesota Reformer, who also reports on labor and housing issues, as we're going to be chatting about some labor stories that he's been working on for the past few days, because a few of these have maybe flown under the radar, but could have an impact on some policy and, well, the news cycle here in Minnesota today. So we're going to be chatting about that. And again, make sure you follow Minnesota Reformer over at minnesotareformer.com for the best in Minnesota news and politics. Max, thanks so much for coming back on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Brett.
Absolutely. So I want to start off talking about the DFL state convention, which recently occurred, because one issue propped up during that convention that has typically divided two DFL constituencies. That would be labor and the environment. Now, environmental activists wanted the DFL to hold hearings on Prove It First legislation, which would block copper-nickel mining in Minnesota until there's independent scientific proof that a similar mine has operated elsewhere in the country for at least 10 years and has been closed for at least 10 years without polluting. A compromise was eventually reached instead, where the DFL will push to hold legislative hearings on copper-nickel mining in general, which is something that has not happened in more than a decade. So I want to talk about both perspectives, and let's start off talking about the labor union, because Joel Smith, who is the president of LIUNA, Minnesota and North Dakota's chapter, mentioned that the legislation circumvents the comprehensive environmental review process. And I want you to elaborate a little bit more about what this process entails and why the unions are largely seeing the process as, well, pretty much being set right now and not really needing any changes when it comes to copper-nickel mines.
Yeah, so, like you said, this issue of copper-nickel mining, especially with the prospective mines near the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, has really divided Democrats, those who support union and the union jobs that it could bring, and those who say the risk is just too great. And so LIUNA, which represents laborers, it's the laborers union and construction workers who would be, ostensibly working in some of these mines or on them or around them, say, we can do this, we can do it safely, we need to mine these metals to fuel our transition to a green economy, because copper, nickel, and other metals that we can mine here will go into solar panels and car batteries and wind turbines. And so they say it's just too big of an opportunity for Minnesota to pass on. And so at issue here is whether the DFL will hold hearings on this Prove It First legislation. And so the change at the state party was pretty it was a small detail. So at the state convention they're, deciding what the state policy or policy agenda is going to be. And so environmentalists wanted the party to agree that we're going to hold hearings on the Prove It First legislation, like you said, which, is this high standard of proving that you can do this without any contamination for 20 years. The laborers and other labor unions got that tweak to say the legislature will hold hearings on copper and nickel mining in general. So this is kind of a big tweak, but it's going to set up some discussions at the legislature to discuss copper nickel mining in the state broadly, which haven't happened in more than a decade. Earlier this year, Senate Majority Leader Aaron Murphy canceled a hearing on Prove It First, so there was just this kind of public hearing about copper nickel mining. And like I said, environmentalists say just the risk of polluting one of Minnesota's greatest assets, its water, is just too great. And also note that the economic engine that is tourism in northern Minnesota, especially around the Boundary Waters, is even greater than that of mining. And so in order to protect this other economic job-creating industry, we also need to protect Minnesota's environment.
So what was the reception from environmentalists when they at least saw this compromise come out at the DFL convention? Was this something that they felt went far enough, or is this something that they would still like to see more changes and more expansion on in the future? And I'm also kind of curious what this will mean at the state legislature and what kind of impact these hearings could have.
Yeah, so environmentalists accused labor unions of being in the pocket of these multinational corporate mining behemoths, and had some really strong language for their support for mining up north. But I think it's pretty understandable that labor unions would support union job creating industries. And we even see with the United Steelworkers are, really supportive that the Cleveland Cliffs get sold to, that the Cleveland Cliffs take over the U.S. steel mines up north. And I think the issue, it's a little unclear how it's all going to play out because there's so many different regulations happening on so many different levels. I mean, I note in the story that the Biden administration withdrew more than 225,000 acres near the Boundary Waters Wilderness from mineral leasing for 20 years. So this resolution by no means says copper nickel mining is going forward. It's really a small change, but I think it was interesting to report on to show how this divide continues to develop within the DFL party, which of course is in control of state government. And so it's really important what the state party agrees to in at its conventions. And I'll just note that there are even environmentalists are divided over the Prove It First legislation. Some people say. Some environmentalists say that, okay, this is a good standard. Like, if you can show that there's no pollution, then we can move forward with it. And there's others, environmentalists, who say, no, we just simply cannot mine at all near the Boundary Waters and the watersheds because it's just too great a risk of polluting, one of Minnesota's greatest assets.
Yeah, and I think even the labor issue is even a little divided on this as well as to whether the Prove It First legislation should go through or we should have stronger environmental protections. So we will follow along with that. Want to move on to another story, and that has to do with a possible strike that could be taking place with nursing home workers in New Hope. Because hundreds of nursing home workers at one of Minnesota's largest facilities, that's St. Therese over in New Hope, are set to go on strike this Saturday for 5 days over wage disputes. This comes after hundreds of other nursing home workers throughout the Twin Cities walked off for about 24 hours in March. And since that time, 11 other facilities in the Twin Cities have settled contracts with workers, oftentimes winning double-digit wage increases. So let's get a little background on this. Can you provide an overview of the situation at St. Therese and the main reason why these nearly 200 nursing home workers have decided to go on strike this weekend?
Yeah, so as you alluded to, workers at St. Therese, along with hundreds of others at 11 other nursing homes in the Twin Cities, walked off the job earlier this year, and now 11 those other 11 have settled contracts, and St. Therese remains the single holdout. And like most union negotiations, this comes down to economics. The nursing home has given workers a temporary bonus, per hour bonus that they want to have, that the union wants to have solidified in the contract, but St. Therese is not agreeing to that while still making verbal assurances that this pay bump will continue. Now, a wrinkle to all of this is that the the nursing facility announced that it's going to sell to another company in a couple months, and the union cried foul on that because it says in the contract we should have 90 days notice before a sale is to occur. And so now there's really some motivation on the union side to make sure that these wages, these higher wages, are enshrined in the contract so that they don't go away when a new owner takes over. And so that's where we really see the rub right now. And I'll have to say, this strike earlier this year was one of the largest strikes at a nursing home in state history. And again, to see nearly 200 nursing home workers walk off the job at a facility for 5 days. I mean, think about it. Like, nursing homes are already talking about being in a staffing crisis and not being able to find enough workers. And so to be able to lose 200 workers over 5 days has really got to be scary for patients and or residents and nursing home managers who will have to bring in temp workers or have managers work on the floors. Of course, union workers will always say a strike is a last resort, and it's not something they do willingly, but they do for the future benefit of workers and the residents they care for.
Yeah, absolutely. You think about the number of facilities and, as you said, just a shortage of workers. That would have a massive impact on families and probably draw a lot of concerns. But as we alluded to, it did lead to many of these nursing home workers winning much higher wages. I want to talk a little bit more about an aspect that I think you alluded to, and that's this temporary $5 pay increase that played into negotiations because, as I understand, the workers are very concerned that when St. Therese ends up being sold to this other company called Compass, this might affect their current situation where maybe that $5 increase wouldn't be honored. I'm just curious about how that would work with that change of ownership and how that would possibly change the contract.
Yeah, I mean, it just comes down to what's in the contract and what's not. And if that $5 per hour pay increase isn't in the contract and isn't in the wage scale, the new company has no legal obligation to honor this temporary differential, as far as I'm aware, and so that's really the worry here. And just another thing I'll note is, as listeners may know about, I've heard about the Nursing Home Workforce Standards Board, which is one of the farthest-reaching labor standards board in the country, where there's a board made up of nursing home workers and lawmakers and or agency heads and nursing home representatives who have the power to set pay standards across the industry for union and non-union workers alike. And they voted earlier this year to set an average minimum wage of $23.49 per hour by 2027, I believe. And so, yeah, the first pay bump would happen in 2026, and the next pay bump would happen in 2027. Now, there's still some bureaucratic hurdles for that to go through, but as part of that state law, this board that was created in the 2023 legislative session, workers across the industry are on track to get a significant pay bump, which advocates say will help shore up that staffing issue, because it's hard to compete for workers to work in a nursing home, which is grueling work, when you could get a much higher paying job doing something easier, probably down the street.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen that countless other times where people have left the industry simply because they're not getting paid enough for what is extremely tough work. I want to move on to a couple other stories before we have to wrap things up today. And I want to talk a little bit about Amazon, because 34 senators, both Republicans and Democrats, and including them were Amy Klobuchar and Tina Smith, sent a letter to Amazon saying the company has been evasive and self-contradictory in information it's provided to Congress about mistreatment of workers for its delivery service program. As you're probably aware, if you get stuff from Amazon, you probably see those drivers all over town and oftentimes stopping and dropping stuff off at the doorstep. But the crux of the issue has to do with something we've commonly seen in our kind of new gig economy, and that is technically who is defined as an employee versus an independent contractor. That's something we've oftentimes seen with Uber and Lyft, and now that controversy has moved on to Amazon. Now, Amazon does train their drivers who wear Amazon uniforms and drive Amazon-branded trucks, which are equipped with Amazon's AI-powered surveillance cameras. So I'm curious, why does Amazon say they're technically not employees when, to me, they very much seem like they are behaving as employees, given what I just said? And I assume that's kind of the concerns of what many of these senators are writing about as well.
Right. So I don't want to go too far in speculating why Amazon has determined that these workers are contractors, but I'll just note that there are clear economic incentives to do so, because if these drivers are independent contractors, they're responsible for paying for the vans, paying for the gas. There's far less labor standards that Amazon is responsible for, and again, it's through layers of contracting. So Amazon says the delivery services is by contractors, so those workers, those delivery drivers, aren't actual employees of Amazon, which means they're not responsible for ensuring the workers have a safe work environment, that they're getting paid minimum wage, so they're getting paid overtime. And so, we've seen this in a lot of industries where, especially in construction, you see it a lot, where there's these layers of contracting and subcontracting, which saves people at the top money and liability by being able to claim that they're not actually responsible for those workers' well-being or pay. And so this is, a letter that these senators sent to Amazon with follow-up questions, and noting that, the first answers they got were contradictory and didn't seem to be correct. And so these senators are trying to suss out, and they believe that Amazon is a joint employer of these workers. And if they can show that if it can be shown that Amazon has significant authority over these workers' day-to-day behavior and work, then they can be considered a joint employer and jointly responsible for the labor laws covering them.
And finally, one more story I'd like to talk about with you, and that has to do with the Minneapolis Police Union, because a new contract looks like it might be approved, which would, at least for now, provide an 11.5% raise over 3 years to most police officers, with veterans, or at least some veterans, getting up to a 21.7% pay increase. Now, it sounds like Mayor Jacob Fry is largely on board with this new contract, but I am curious, because the city council still has yet to approve this contract, what kind of the response has been from them? Has there been any pushback, or what kind of happens next in this whole process of the Minneapolis Police Union getting their new contract approved? Because as I understand, this has been a contentious issue in the past, so I'm curious where things stand right now.
Right. Yeah, so this contract has historic pay raises for police officers, and as we'll note, the Minneapolis Police Department is incredibly understaffed or having issues attracting and retaining officers. And so they say, like we said in the nursing home industry, is if you raise wages, you can attract more people to the job. So they say this is necessary. But, since for years, there have been criticisms about how much the city is paying officers, especially in overtime pay, in PTSD claims, and in lawsuit settlements for misconduct lawsuits. So I expect that this is This is supposed to go before the council on Thursday. I expect we may see some pushback from council members on, just how much of a raise the city has agreed to, and if they'll approve it or not, especially given that the city is facing a budget deficit. So it's a challenging topic, but I think the council would be hard pressed to reject the contract too. Just the position that they're in. This has been negotiations have been going on for 8 months. They've gone through mediation, so it would be a lot to send it back to the drawing board, but it could happen.
Well, if we can follow more about that and other stories we talked about today over at MinnesotaReformer.com, as we have been speaking with Max Nesterak, who is the deputy editor of The Reformer and reports on labor and housing news. Again, make sure you go to MinnesotaReformer.com, MinnesotaReformer.com. Max, thanks so much for coming on the show today and pinch hitting for Patrick. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
All right, let's take a break and send things back over to Matt McNeil on AM 950.
The edge of